Hi, I'm Jonathan Larsen, and I'm here with Suraj Patel, who's running for Congress in the Democratic primary for the 12th District of New York, and made headlines as an early politician to come forward as having had the coronavirus. As you'll see, is clearly doing better now, which we're all happy about, and has also made, sorry?
Not the best thing to be an early adopter in, but
That's right. Not where you want to be on the leading edge. Although I would guess, to be a little grim about it, better than going at the peak, I would imagine. But you also made headlines for what you had to say about the public policy response to this, and that's a big part of why I wanted to talk to you for TYTI Daily. So let's start with the sort of human aspect of it, which is it wasn't just you who were infected. There were others around you as well. How's everyone doing?
Yeah, everyone's great. So I live in the East Village in New York City with my brother, who is an emergency room doctor, my younger brother, who's my policy director on this campaign, and my older brother's girlfriend, who's a cardiologist. So we had plenty of medical advice in my apartment, but we all had coronavirus at the same time. Everyone is great and fine now. We're actually donating plasma to the Mount Sinai plasma serum study right now. And we're fully recovered. So thank you. We are fortunate ones to both have had relatively mild infections that was still pretty brutal. It still lasted a week, more than a week, and was the most sick I've been probably in my adult life. But we also were the lucky ones because my brother is an ER doctor. We had access to tests that we did at home ourselves and sent to a lab. And what I think is so frustrating about this response has been that we bungled this back in January. Well, we bungled this in 2016 when we elected Donald Trump. Then we bungled it again in January when he ignored it. But come March, when we knew testing, universal testing, was the only way out of this crisis, we still had people in both parties, including Democrats, including my opponent, saying, "Oh, it's too late for testing. We don't need testing. Now you just stay home, be sick, and hope for the best," And so I was the first campaign to come out with a universal testing plan, not just as a candidate, but even people in Congress, which is sad because you've got progressive challengers like me coming up with ideas that need to become the truth. And now we see the damage that has been done by a lack of availability of testing and by an unseriousness to get us there. So I am very glad that people are now finally taking this seriously, because the only economic stimulus that's going to work is testing every single person for their antibodies or for the antigen of coronavirus, and then starting to get life moving again and isolating those cases and tracing.
And you referred to your opponent, that's Democratic incumbent Carolyn Maloney. Can you, since you brought her up, can you say what your thoughts are on where she is now in terms of the congressional and the public policy response to where we are now?
Disappeared. What I think is so frustrating, we're in New York City. We're the epicenter of this epidemic or pandemic now globally. Over 16,000 people have already died. And McConnell just told us that he doesn't want a blue state bailout. The Republicans have punished New York time and again for not voting for their choices for president and Congress. And now here we are again being told by the president and by McConnell to drop dead. But what I'm angry about is, where is the outrage? Where is my New York delegation throwing chairs and screaming on TV and asking about and talking about this outrage on a daily basis? Where are the fiery speeches? I know where AOC is. I know where Max Rose is. Thank God for them. New Yorkers are fighters. We have grit, but we can't do it alone. Our congressional representatives have completely disappeared on us in this moment of crisis. Now, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised because I'm running against an ineffective 28-year incumbent who takes more corporate PAC money than Mitt Romney and most congressional Republicans, and has now bailed out major banks and corporations twice in my lifetime, and still continues to take their corporate PAC money. So I'm not shocked, but I am pretty angry at the way New York is being treated right now by the federal government.
So in March, you talked about, you went public with this in a Medium post in March, and you wrote, quote, "If we fail to universally test, we face an indefinite amount of time in social distancing." So had we done universal testing in March, as you advocated, what would today look like right now, the end of April? Where would we be right now?
Well, So first off, we need to get the capacity for testing up. We need to test both things: the people who are currently infected with coronavirus via testing the antigen, via antigen testing. We also need to start testing for people with antibodies to know whether they've already had it. Early estimates point to over 15% of New Yorkers have already had coronavirus. Now, as that happens, and as we know who's had it, we can slowly start to allow them to get back to work. We get first responders tested every 2 weeks, every week, and making sure that this disease doesn't spread. I would say, had that happened in March, here in April, we'd know a lot more. But fast forward by 2-3 months, we would really be able to safely start opening up major sectors of the economy, because here's what's going to happen. Donald Trump is trying to push to open the economy. And when it does, two things are going to happen. One, infections are going to spike. And two, if people themselves don't feel safe, it doesn't matter if a restaurant's legally allowed to open. No one's going to that restaurant. So unless we test and trace, we're not going to get people to have the buy-in to go back out in the streets, to go to restaurants, get our small businesses and our workers back out, and move on from this crisis. So we need some forward thinking, but I feel like Congress just literally, reacts to Trump's failures and waits for more. And I just think that's why we need proactive Democrats and leaders out there. And again, hats off to some of the ones that are being vocal.
You mentioned one aspect of the reopen the economy thing that I've been thinking a little bit about lately. And I don't mean this to sound conspiratorial, but it does seem to me that if you as the government now say, okay, businesses, you can reopen, it seems to me that what they're kind of opening the door to is the prospect of saying, oh, you couldn't get any customers? That's not our fault anymore.
I don't think that's conspiratorial at all. I think they want to wash their hands of the responsibility in this crisis. So, I mean, small businesses are the lifeblood of our economy. Workers are the lifeblood of our economy, and many are most employed by small businesses in this country. Main Street is America, and we as Democrats ought to be firmly on the side of Main Street and our workers. And of course, in the long term, this just underscores some of the reasons I'm running for office. We need Medicare for all. We need a Green New Deal. We need a stronger safety net. We need to look at racial and economic justice in this country, because we're seeing, again, another crisis being born, the brunt of which is being borne by people of color who can't work from home. All of those things are in the long term. But in the short term, the only things that we should be talking about are jobs in the economy, jobs in the economy, jobs in the economy. And what I think Congress thinks they're doing, and Washington thinks it's doing, is, well, we're washing our hands of this. Let's move on. Oh, let's start being concerned about the deficit again. You know that's coming. You can mark my words. And yet, this is a marathon. We're at the quarter mile marker and have 25 3/4 left to go. After this crisis is over, we're going to need a sustained long-term intervention by the federal government and the Federal Reserve into the economy to get people back to work, to full employment, to get wages rising again. They cannot wash their hands of this, because people are not going to be going out to restaurants in full capacity. Music festivals and Broadway, those things are not going to be at full capacity if people even feel safe enough to go. So you've got to get people feeling safe. That's only going to happen through, hopefully one day soon, a vaccine, some treatments, and then obviously testing and tracing.
And you've referred sort of broadly to Congress and congressional Democrats. It's my job to make people a little uncomfortable and say, well, who exactly do you mean? Like, how is Pelosi doing in your eyes? How is Schumer doing? If they're not doing well, according to you, what should they be doing that they're not doing?
Well, I think that, when the CARES Act passed back in late March, it's still crazy to me that they did not have any sort of proactive universal testing component. They just expected Donald Trump to do the right thing. And I'm sick and tired of Democrats waiting for Trump to fail and then holding oversight hearings about it, or Democrats waiting for Trump to fail or giving him the platform to act like a wartime president right now. We need to present an alternative, a proactive alternative. We should have had a universal testing plan in March and stuck it into the CARES Act. We should have held firm and gotten state and local aid funded, because states have balanced budget amendments and problems. They cannot deficit spend and borrow. McConnell just told us to declare bankruptcy for states. Do you have any idea how much human pain that will cause, and how much longer this depression after this would go on if that were the case? It's crazy. So I think Democrats ought to be presenting vocally a true and serious alternative to what the Republicans are proposing every single time. You can't, I feel like we have been afraid to lose for so long that we've forgotten how to win. And again, there's a few out there, obviously, that are vocal, that are passionate, and you know the ones I'm talking about. And those are the ones I think we should be emulating and finding more of.
Well, so you've had very kind words for Governor Andrew Cuomo, which is something I've talked a little bit about here on TYTI Daily. The idea that he strikes a tonal approach that I think a lot of Democrats like. But if you look at the policies he's actually enacted from a progressive point of view, I think some of the progressive wing of the party might take some issue with your praise for Governor Cuomo. So I'm wondering if you can dive into your thoughts on him and his leadership here for a bit.
Totally. So my praise for Governor Cuomo has only been about this crisis and taking it seriously. I have for a long time had problems with Governor Cuomo, his IDC, that I also helped fight against. I have been.
You could explain, because everyone. That's
so
okay. New Yorkers know what that is, but
yeah, that's right. That's right. The Governor Cuomo for a decade, almost for 8 years, has had propped up an independent runaway gang of Democratic senators with Republicans in the state Senate in order to hold up progressive legislation. He propped those up and then utilized that as an excuse to not pass progressive legislation, and we all thought that.
The Democrats technically had a majority, but this bloc would essentially caucus with the Republicans enough, right?
Yeah, and veto or effectively block any progressive legislation.
Right.
One of which I always talked about for years has been New York is one of the most voter suppressive states in the country, with some of the hardest voting laws and some of the lowest turnouts. And that is to keep incumbents in power. And I have a lot of angry words for Governor Cuomo and others right now who are engaged in incumbency protection racket, even during this crisis, to not take seriously mail-in voting and to, in my election, which is less than 2 months, almost just 2 months away now. And we have no idea whether or not it's going to be held and how it's going to be held. So I take a lot of issue with Governor Cuomo. I think he should have raised taxes on the ultra-rich in order to make up some of these budget shortfalls. I can't believe in this crisis he would cut Medicaid and other funding. So I think the only thing that I praise Governor Cuomo for is taking tonal leadership and presenting an alternative, at least, to Donald Trump during this crisis. But the jury's still out on how we're performing in this crisis. I mean, if we had shut down the state a week earlier, we would have saved untold lives.
Right. So let's drill a little bit into the specifics, because you got some attention for the fact that you were very early in rolling out a specific plan on what universal testing would look like. And I did read your piece in Wired magazine talking a little bit about it. I don't remember there being much of an emphasis on contact tracing, but tell me the specifics of what your plan entailed and whether we've got any prospect or hope of coming anywhere close to what you're talking about and why that matters.
Totally. So I want to talk about two different things. First, I'll talk about the testing and the plan, and then I do want to talk about contact tracing. Let me just say it straight up. As a lawyer, I have been very, very concerned about the civil liberties aspects of what's happened across the country. Governors, including Cuomo, governing by fiat and executive order. And I'm very, very worried and terrified of sort of the precedent we have set here. So on testing, what we proposed, and when I say we, my brother and I co-wrote this article in Wired magazine, is to try and universally test Americans for both antigen for currently having coronavirus and the antibodies for whether they've had it or not. Being able to do that throughout the course of an infection, and I will not get into the details of the timelines, but you can then categorize people as being red, yellow, or green. Those who have COVID, those who are at risk of getting it, yellow, and those who have already had it, green. They can't get it again. And what we need to do—
We think, right? We think.
Yeah, although very, very good scientific consensus says that almost all types of coronaviruses like this and specific proteins for it say that very likely you will not, at least for a year or so. You may get it again later, but closer to that. So anyway, what we have a shortage of right now is antigen testing, which is the nasal swabs and the capacity to do it. but it isn't because a lack of scientific innovation or discovery. It's a political will and logistics problem. To go into a hospital and get yourself tested for coronavirus requires you to potentially infect others, go out of your house, and then the doctor or the nurse that takes your stuff has to change their PPE every single time. And that is a really wasteful thing when we have other alternatives in other countries are doing, like allowing you to test at home yourself and things like that. So I think we need to make that more available. Now, the capacity to test this is not complicated testing. The reagents and the equipment available needed for this exists in almost every public university lab, including in community colleges, labs. Lots of places have this stuff, including some like super high-end high schools probably have some lab testing equipment. So what we needed was political will to get the logistics of this ramped up so that we could do this across the country. The other side of this is the antibody testing. Now, I know the FDA has approved several antibody tests already, including things that are as simple as pricking a finger at home, putting a dab of blood onto a paper, and it looks like a pregnancy test. The United Kingdom government, the German government, and others have ordered millions of these tests already. And I know that none of them are fully ready to be deployed, but I think we need a government that's proactive and already thinking about the logistics problem of getting a test into everyone's hands via the USPS, which we need to rescue, and getting those results reported onto an online portal. We would have an accurate picture of how much the disease is spread by zip code in this country anonymously if you did that.
Do you support the use of the Defense Production Act to essentially force companies to produce the needed tests?
Absolutely. I support the Defense Production Act for oximeters, for tests. And it's partially because these companies, I think there are a lot of companies out there that'd be willing to do this, but if it's only possible if they have a guaranteed buyer, right? I mean, it's a big risk to take on for someone.
A profit margin.
Yeah, I mean, but the Defense Production Act will give you a guaranteed buyer. That's the idea, right? Like you'll produce 300 million test kits because you know the government will buy them. And that's, I think, what it's for.
So, and would these be free in your thinking?
Absolutely.
Everyone would get them? Yeah,
I think everyone, absolutely. Right. First off, a antibody test in the retail market costs $10. So we're talking about a paltry sum compared to the trillions of dollars we're facing right now to end this.
Prevention, right?
Yeah. But I do want to say, though, on the contact tracing component of this, I am troubled already by the lack of discussion and forthrightness around so many of the orders we've seen so far. We were told you don't need masks because they don't work. And then we were all of a sudden told, oh, wait, masks work to prevent. Well, we all knew that. We're not stupid. We all knew that's logical. If they work on doctors, they work on us. But they lied to us because they're covering up the fact that there was a shortage of masks. Well, again, the government over and over with these people in it always focus on tamping down the demand side rather than increasing the supply side. And so I don't understand why we keep trusting and giving more and more power by fiat to folks who have proven that they've failed at this crisis time and again. And it's scary to me how quickly sort of we've been ruled by mob and by Twitter and by one or two individuals at the top of every state in the country and went along with it. We've been told to stay at home and away from each other. And I think, of course, I support that right now because I know we need to save lives, but I need legit justifications. I need senators and Congress people and assembly people to have to go vote on these things. I need a federal judge to be able to review something if it completely changes who we are on the other side of it.
And you want there to be a reason for it, right? The point behind social distancing.
Justification for it, not just I feel like it.
For measures to be taken. So one thing I think about a lot is the fact that even not only centrist Democrats, but a lot of Republicans are very happy and quick to lean on measures that would look and sound socialist if they were applied to things like cancer or heart disease. And my own theory about this is that we tell ourselves stories about why and how people deal with crises and what those crises mean. And it seems to me that coronavirus is so fast and so lethal that it kind of erases the idea of any causal culpability in terms of the people getting it not being able to prepare. But I'm wondering why you think it is that coronavirus sort of makes it okay for even Republicans to start enacting what are essentially very, borderline socialist government responses, and yet that's not applicable. Those stories don't apply to heart disease or the flu.
Yeah, I think I love that question. That old adage, there are no atheists in foxholes. I think we're in this.
Pat Tillman was trending yesterday. I don't know if you noticed that.
I didn't notice that, no. Wow, okay, yeah, there are no atheists in foxholes. We're in a situation in which what feels like no one has answers to a almost invisible enemy, 14 nanometer wide enemy.
I'm so glad you said that, because I keep wanting to say it's not invisible. You just need a microscope.
Exactly. It's only invisible if you don't really get science, guys. And so we, and we're in this fight, and it's happening so fast around us, and it doesn't leave you time to sort of say, wire it through your heuristics about this is a Republican thing and this is a Democrat thing and this is right. It's just a survival. And the trillions of dollars we're spending on this, and the recovery and all that, just will go to show. And we should be there to remind them time and again after this that on pandemics, on climate change, on these long-term major catastrophic potential issues, you should look at investing in stopping them as insurance. If we had paid the down payment of $10 billion a year for pandemic preparedness and basic scientific research on pandemics, perhaps that over the course of 10 years, that may have totaled $100 billion and saved millions of lives and trillions of dollars.
And by the way, not so by the way, one of the foreseeable, long predicted consequences of climate change is an increase in pandemics.
Yes, exactly. And so we proposed a climate and pandemic research and development moonshot. Now you're going to say, no, call bullshit on me, but we wrote this thing over the last, since December, January, February, submitted it for publication into Scientific American before all of this happened. And now we're like, well, see what I mean? We wanted it at the height of the space race, America spent 2% of its GDP on public research and development. Today, that number is 0.7%, which amounts to about a $300 billion differential. Imagine what $300 billion would do. Did you know only 22% of grant applications to the National Institutes of Health are accepted, which means 78% of potential things that we could have been discovering, some directly related to this, may have been funded. And so if after this we don't learn our lesson on giant structural change in our economy, in our relationship with our government, and then of course in our relationship with science, then we're crazy. And it doesn't, and it hurts, or for me, it's crazier that I'm running against a congressperson in Carolyn Maloney, who was a leading anti-vaccine advocate in Congress for 15 years, 9 anti-vaccine bills. And I just don't understand how after this crisis, when the world is waiting for one vaccine so badly, somebody could have been opposed to, drumming up conspiracy theories about the ones that actually work.
I must confess I wasn't familiar with those votes on in her record. So, assuming she responds, is there anything you want to say preemptively to your critique here?
Absolutely. I mean, you don't have to take my word for it. You can just Google. You can just
Google,
right, and watch C-SPAN hearings,
right.
and take her own word for it.
So one thing that you brought up is the idea that we did have warnings about this, and one of the drums that I like to beat is that yes, absolutely, the president should take the heat for the failure to heed those warnings. However, the other thing I would say is that we were holding a Democratic presidential primary, and there is nothing stopping any of those candidates when they are up on that stage. We know that they are quite capable of switching to talk about whatever they want to talk about. And not only could they have talked about our failures in pandemic preparation, but my guess is that there are other things out there that any number of government reports sitting in desks right now are warning us about, and identifying measures that we could take right now. One example I'll give you is when Katrina happened, like right when Katrina happened, I wrote about a government report at the time that basically said Katrina is going to happen. It also said we're not doing enough to prepare for an absolutely city-destroying Michael Bay level earthquake on the West Coast. So it's not just Donald Trump who fails the test of identifying and preparing for threats that no one else is incentivizing you to do. Neither are the Democrats, and the media don't do it either. So it's sort of a collective failure here. And I guess I want to get your thoughts on why is it that we all, to some extent, have that same failure. It's not just Trump, even though it's his job more than anyone's. It's also all of ours, right?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and it's easy to second guess some of these things, you know, in a vacuum, looking backwards and not sort of thinking about where you were then. But the truth is this: ignoring the presidential candidates, because I don't know where they are, many of them specifically what they were doing. For example, Biden was nowhere in Congress or anything, but Congress had been receiving briefings about coronavirus. People that were running for office, running for president, that were in Congress should have been receiving briefings about coronavirus, and they did. And if
or about hypothetical pandemics,
yeah, and if they weren't talking about it, and here we were talking about it as a congressional primary campaign and talking about massive moonshots and basic research, then some of these people probably you know, aren't doing their jobs, and maybe we need different types of people running for office in this country. You know, on March 4th, we held a coronavirus public health briefing in my district with 4 expert doctors and public health officials for my campaign for our community. And that was March 4th. Prior to that, I think Congress had received multiple briefings on this thing or been told about it. My opponent, Carolyn Maloney, did not even mention coronavirus in a public way until March 15th. And that was just to announce she was shutting down her DC office.
Right.
So I think, you know, there's so much wait for your turn, wait for the leadership to tell us what poll tested massage talking points we should use, and then go out and put them out. And I think that's our problem when it comes to providing counterpoint to Donald Trump and to Republicans, which is we're not showing leadership if we're always waiting to wait for, you know, what's politically the expedient thing to do.
So
and say.
I want to give you maybe a hardball and then a total softball. One is, if we take coronavirus and climate change off the table, what is something else that a different kind of leader should be thinking about and talking about right now that we're not hearing about?
Well, I think that, you know, what's happening in our economy when people are being told to shut down their small businesses, when people are being told that you can't go to your service industry job or you can't go back to your job, like, we shouldn't have to be begging for $1,200 checks once in a while. We should have had a direct intervention by the Federal Reserve, instructed by Congress, to start directly depositing $2,000 checks or $1,600 checks or whatever into people's bank accounts for every single American, regardless of income, age, or whatever, because frankly, this is a universal problem. This virus is not a rich or poor problem. This is just a universal thing and no one created it. So what we should do is get this economy sustained and keep putting money in people's pockets. Another thing we should have done, which I called for, was England and Denmark masterfully sort of indefinitely provided 80% payroll to businesses shut down indefinitely. Right. What I think is crazy is that we as we as workers, we as small businesses basically are being told, you can't do this anymore. You can't live your life anymore. You can't survive. And you need to sort of wait for our generosity as Congress and Washington to send you back some compensation or help for that. And we should be thankful for it each time it happens, rather than like, who's working for who here? And so I think we need some pretty dramatic interventions in the economy.
And so on that, I do want to follow up on that before I toss you our softball. But so when you talk about dramatic intervention, one thing that I was talking about pretty early on, I think, was the idea of, what if you suspended rent payments, but also mortgage payments and also property taxes, so that you basically shut down that extractive chain and maybe not just for where you live, but also for things like utilities, so that you made sure that everyone along the chain, no one was on the hook.
Yep.
Would you have supported something quite so radical along those lines?
Yes, you should. The medium we published with our COVID response at the beginning at the end of last month, I think, asked for that exact thing, which is a rent moratorium and a principal freeze for all mortgages, so that and what we're asking for is extending the maturities. If you have a 30-year mortgage and you don't pay mortgage for a year, that just means that we're extending the year at the end. No one is really losing or taking a haircut here and making it easier like that.
Right.
The financialization of our economy is a big problem, and it's something we should have talked about for decades. A lot of mortgages are held not by any individual originator, but because they've been collateralized and sold off in tranches in multiple forms of bonds. It's really increasingly difficult to get resiliency in this economy when you have such sort of securitization and separation. So we found ourselves in this structural mess we've created since the 80s.
We can go offline and talk about the Commodity Futures Modernization Act afterwards. But I promise you a softball. So the softball question is, you mentioned earlier that we need a new kind of candidate, new kind of political leaders, which is, of course, a great segue to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you so much. And thanks for having me again. Like I said, it was a really enjoyable interview. Look, I'm a first-generation American. My family came to the United States in the late 60s, early 70s. And like almost all immigrants, we didn't get to go to, they didn't go to Wall Street. They didn't go to the Ivy League. We worked in little businesses. My parents were security guards. They delivered pizza. My dad became an engineer worked as an engineer for the MTA. He'd fix track at night and come home in the morning when I'd be going to school. We fit 3 generations of Patels, 13 of us, in a 1-bedroom apartment above that bodega. And then we started a business, and we got to succeed in that business, running mid-scale motels around and things like that. And I got to become an attorney in New York City, and I got to work for the greatest president of our lifetimes. I got to work for Barack Obama, and I saw what it was like to have someone out there who's boldly, when we first campaigned in 2008, especially, there was a lot of hope, optimism, excitement. And I know what that feels like to see when Democrats are leading on ideas, on energy, on youthfulness, on optimism. And I've seen how devastating it is when Democrats are playing constant defense for the last, decade, basically. I've lived through, different income brackets. I've had to make payment when times are tough. I've had to live through a financial crisis that made me take no pay while making payroll during bankruptcies. And I teach business ethics at NYU, and I'm a lawyer. I mean, I've got to live so many different things. It's only possible when you have an America that has upward mobility at its core, that allows people to move through different classes. And I think we need representation that is reflective of that sort of new America, that new story. It's not people who have been in office for 3 decades who are going to get us out of this mess and make us, create new structural change. It's going to be people with new ideas who are taking bold chances, like primarying 28-year incumbents, and doing it with the zeal and glee that I am, because this is really important. This is our future.
Can I fight with you just a little bit on something you said just there?
Sure.
I say often that I distrust politicians who talk about new ideas. And the reason I say that is because it seems to me that although it was horrific in that it excluded entire cohorts of Americans, we had in this country a set of ideas that were enshrined in our legislative and regulatory regimens that actually did all the things we say we now want new ideas to do, right? We had laws that empowered and enabled labor to be active, successful advocates for a vibrant, growing middle class. We had a corporate structure that didn't incentivize immediately extractive, short-term guidance of companies, let alone seeing companies as things from which to suck the precious lifeblood from. And I associate new ideas with things like the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act and the Enron loophole. To me, it seems all the things that got us here were new ideas that were sold and packaged as bright and shiny, sparkly new ideas, and ended up costing us the old known ideas that basically had not enough of us, but was the proof of the model of how to do it. So now let's fight about that.
Totally. Well, I think you've pinpointed some of the problems with the old ideas as major ones about excluding, well, frankly, people like me from them. But I think we're, I'm in broad agreement with you that so many of the new ideas we need are really just updates of really good old ones. And I think that, it'd be like, it's like, let's call it new trends then, right? So bell bottoms aren't a new idea, but if I started wearing them around, it'd be trendy and new. And I think we're in that same boat when it comes to updating and modernizing. A good example is public school, right? So in the late 1800s, we decided that 8 years of school was not enough for the modern economy. So we added high school and standardized it across all 50 states. Here we are in 2020, and we know that we need more than K through 12. We need K through 12 plus. We need vocational school, community college, and tuition-free college. And so that's not an old idea. It's a new idea, but it is an update of an old idea. And so I think you're right. The roots of what we need to go back to are in our past. A strong labor movement to counteract the power of corporations, to get corporate money out of politics, which wasn't ever the case after the first progressive era in the early 1900s. And some of these things are pretty simple, like Medicare for all is a new idea, but it is just extending public health care to all Americans at a baseline level. And we all believe that would be really nice right now.
And that was an old idea. They just
people. Yeah, what's worse than 25 million people on unemployment rolls? 25 million people without health care as well.
Right. The other thing that along the same lines that strikes me is that right now the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is fighting to make sure that there are good, sustainable living wage jobs for everyone. If you went back 100 years ago, the dream at the time was for people not to have to work as much, right? They wanted robots. They saw robots as liberators, but now we've become so kind of anxious about our economy that now the jobs themselves are seen as the things we want as opposed to what they were meant to get us.
Yeah, the outputs you get us, right? That's a good point. I honestly hadn't thought about that.
How do we change that, right? Because now a job has become the be-all, end-all. It used to be that the things that jobs could get us, leisure time, the opportunity to enrich our lives with art and other people, we used to say it would be good if we had to work less. And that was a mainstream economists, right, would push that vision.
I found it fascinating how many people in this last year or so really grasped onto sort of what seemed to be, I mean, you and I probably agreed that these are things that are far long overdue in terms of helping ordinary Americans and workers, but the media was so shocked at, for example, some of the popularity behind Andrew Yang's sort of universal basic income type policies. And I'm like, it's not shocking. Right. And I think one of the underreported parts of UBI for him was that it would encourage some of the things that make life interesting and worth living. It would encourage risk-taking behavior. It would encourage expansion of the arts and things like that leisure time buys you. But even risk-taking, being able to have the ability to start a small business or something and knowing that you have some support behind you, right, is what makes some of the innovation around us possible.
The failure of your company will be the failure of your company rather than the destitution of your family and the loss of your home.
Yep.
So in talking about the new leadership, you mentioned earlier, we've got people who've spent decades in power. There is, I'm sure you're well aware, and then I will let you go. I'm just enjoying the conversation. There is on the left in the Democratic Party still, even with Bernie Sanders' announcement, and yes, he's still on the ballot, and that still matters for reasons down the line, but he's now endorsed Joe Biden, and a lot of people on the left, or at least on the left on Twitter, have a lot of misgivings about Joe Biden, whether to support him or not. And to some extent, of course, it's a replay of 2016. But I just want to get you on the record, not just, I'm sure you've said already, whether you do or do not support Joe Biden for president, but also address that question of whether everyone should on the left, or whether it's, okay not to, or to reject the lesser of two evils argument, all of that.
I mean, I just think that you're coming from a real place of privilege if you think that there is no veritable difference between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Of course, you have to support Joe Biden because Donald Trump literally puts children in cages at our borders, literally decimating our public housing in our cities. He's literally letting people die right now because they don't vote for him. So anyone who thinks that there's some sort of academic thing that they have about lesser of two evils or whatever, frankly, is selfish as hell to think that you don't want to support Joe Biden simply because he's not our first choice, and he wasn't mine either. But at this point, we've got to unite and beat Donald Trump. That's all there is to it. He's an existential threat to our democracy, and frankly, lives are in the balance here.
All right. Well, Suraj Patel, thank you so much for your time. And if people are interested in your campaign, learning more about you, getting involved, what can they do? Where should they go?
Yeah, thank you. You can go to www.surajpatel.nyc. That's S-U-R-A as in Apple, J as in Jack, P-A-T-E-L.nyc. And then all of our socials are also Suraj Patel NYC. So please check us out. Our primary, as of now, is on June 23rd in New York. It is the first big chance for us to prove, after Bernie and for after coronavirus, that we will not take the status quo anymore.
Thanks very much for that. And thanks for joining us here on TYTI Daily. And thanks everyone for watching. We're here every day at 11:30 a.m. Eastern time, every weekday. And if you don't already, please subscribe. Take care of each other. Take care of yourselves. And we'll see you later. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.